I want to talk about the devastating flooding in Vermont, but also our recovery. Last week, my wife Marcel and I probably drove 400 miles around the state of Vermont, inside the state. We're a small state, and the distinguished presiding officer knows how in small states you can go from one end to the other fairly quickly. But we crisscrossed the state over a period of a little over a week. A lot of the time, just the two of us in the car, we just drive around and go and say thank you to volunteers. Some of the things we saw were so touching. People who had lost everything were helping others, and vice versa. The spirit is wonderful, but the reality is that our little state, the state where both my wife and I were born, has been hurt in a way that we have not seen in our lifetime. I have talked about these inspiring actions of Vermonters. One of the things we saw, some of the worst damage caused by the storm has been to the houses and mobile homes and apartments, where Vermonters have built their lives, they've made their homes, they've become part of the communities, their kids go to school, they're the fabric of the community. We've seen entire mobile home developments washed away. Where homes once stood, now lies a path of damage and destruction and heartbreak. Look at the horrific flooding we have right here. Roads suddenly where there were no roads. Look at the forefront of this picture. House collapsed in on itself. Children's toys, what might have been a playground at one time, now devastated. Had people tell me, we lost everything. And then in tears, we lost our wedding album. We lost the pictures of our children when they graduated from high school. We lost the pictures at their baptism or their bar mitzvah. I mean, it just tears you apart because they've lost not only their homes, they've lost part of their memories. Now, I want to commend my staff both here in Washington and in Vermont because they have worked sometimes literally around the clock. They have worked weekends, evenings, days to help. And they've seen firsthand the ruin, the pain delivered by this disaster. They've seen it with their eyes, but they've seen it in the tearful eyes of families around the state. Over the sounds of generators powering sump pumps and heavy equipment removing debris, we've had countless conversations with people as they stared at foundations, empty foundations that once held their homes, as they dug toxic muck out of their basements and shops, and as volunteers helped with pulling down wet drywall in a race against the onset of mold. Most of these conversations begin with memories of fast rising water, but also of death-defying rescues. In Northfield, a town just a few miles from where I live, dozens of homes along the peaceful Dog River were flooded with as much as 6 feet of water. One homeowner who escaped the rising waters only by canoe fears the insurance and FEMA assistance will not be enough to help him restore his home, which is part of his life. And like many of the residents of his Water Street neighborhood, he's left wondering whether rebuilding is possible or even worth the effort. In Brattleboro, Mr. President, that's down in the southeast corner of our state. It's along the Connecticut River. The Connecticut River is the boundary between Vermont and New Hampshire. The Brattleboro Housing Authority lost 60 units of housing. They put families in hotels or on their friends' couches, spread throughout the region, as the Housing Authority tries desperately to fix what is lost. I saw a lot of that damage. I went there with Governor Shumlin. I went there with General Doobie, the head of our Vermont National Guard. I saw it. And in Roxbury, beautiful town of Roxbury, one family along a peaceful brook that's normally about 1 foot wide was forced to their roof of their house as floodwaters rose. And the brook became almost instantly a raging rapid more than 20 feet across, 6 feet deep. In Duxbury, the next town over from mine, in Quechee, in Berlin, and nearly a dozen other towns, mobile home parks quickly became submerged. These homes are especially vulnerable to flood damage. They're easily destroyed by a few feet of water. In areas where they've never seen a few feet of water, and suddenly in seconds it's there. Last week in Woodstock, I visited a mobile home park where on the night of the flood, the entire community crowded onto a small mound in the middle of the park waiting rescue as they watched their homes being destroyed. Marcel and I stood on that mound. It was a beautiful fall day, and we stood there. And we looked down, but you could see everything that had been torn up. You could see the gouges. You could see the damage. And I wondered, how can somebody stand there? Not only see their houses destroyed, watch that water come up, and if it comes just a little bit further, you're going to die too. Just 1 week after the flooding, FEMA estimated that more than 900 homes in Vermont had suffered damage. Today, that number continues to grow. Families who found safety and comfort in their homes before Irene now find themselves living in temporary homes and shelters and hotels. And winter is quickly, quietly approaching. Our small state's ability to build new homes depends greatly on support from federal safety net programs, like the Emergency Community Development Block Grant funding that I was proud to support and included in the Transportation HUD Appropriations Bill. Now, this emergency funding is a first step in addressing the urgent housing needs of states like Vermont that have been struck by natural disasters. We know much more is going to be needed to help our decimated towns and communities, their citizens, get back on their feet. Housing authorities need Section 8 choice vouchers. Now, these sound just like numbers to people. They are life to the people who depend upon them. They need to provide relief to low-income renters permanently displaced. They need the flexibility to make use of the few available units of government subsidized housing without the burden of stringent income eligibility requirements. And I'm proud that in the Senate, on the Appropriations Committee, over the past several weeks, working so hard, we've been able to make prompt, significant, and bipartisan strides toward addressing the emerging disaster recovery need in states like Vermont and New Jersey and North Carolina. Actually, 48 states in the union faced emergency disaster needs this year. Mr. President, I remember the stories my parents and my grandparents told me of flooding long before I was born in Vermont. I'm 71 years old. I've not seen damage and destruction of this magnitude in Vermont in my lifetime. Vermont and other states were hit by Irene are stretched to the limit right now. And just as the victims of past disasters throughout the country were able to rely on their fellow Americans' help in their time of need, including Vermont's help, so should Vermonters be able to count on help when they need it most. And it is regrettable. It is disappointing. Actually, it's incomprehensible that some in Congress continue to insist that assistance can only come at the cost of other federal programs and services relied upon by the American people. Do we take it out of education? Do we take it out of medical research? Do we take it out of job creation? Do we rob Peter to pay Paul? Now, some of these same voices have had no problem with spending hundreds of billions of borrowed dollars on wars waged overseas and on rebuilding communities in Iraq and Afghanistan. They'll borrow the money to rebuild roads and villages and homes in Iraq and Afghanistan. But they're going to apply a different standard to emergency disaster recovery efforts that are desperately needed by Americans, for Americans here at home in America. It's Alice in Wonderland. An old-line Vermonter said to me, and there he said, you know, Pat, we give them money in Iraq and Afghanistan to build homes and bridges and roads, and then they blow them up. Build them here in America. We'll take care of them, and we'll use them. You know, I could give a 10-hour speech on the floor. Those two sentences sum up what I've heard from everybody. I don't care what their political background is or anything else in Vermont. Now is not the time to ask Americans to choose between helping victims of a disaster or to fund cancer research or equipment for first responders or job-creating programs. We need to come together as a country. We always have in the past to pass an emergency disaster bill that provides relief to our states in a time of need. Now, the Senate has answered the call by passing critical disaster relief legislation. It's time for the House to do the same. Let victims of Hurricane Irene start rebuilding their homes. But as they rebuild their homes, Mr. President, they rebuild their lives. As they rebuild their lives, they rebuild our communities. As they rebuild our communities, they rebuild our state. And we are a part of the United States of America.